There's a place in the middle of Manhattan that the entire world knows by its light. Neon and LED, billboard and marquee. The blinding commercial spectacle that has made Times Square one of the most photographed intersections on Earth. Millions of people visit it every year and stand in the middle of that light and take photographs of themselves surrounded by it, as if the light itself is the point, as if Times Square has always been this way, always been this carnival of illumination, always been the place where the American appetite for spectacle found its most concentrated expression. It has not always been this way. Go back to the beginning of the 20th century, to the 1900s, the first decade before the neon, before the electric signs, before the New Year's Ball, before Broadway became synonymous with the theater industry. And you find something completely different. You find a neighborhood in the middle of a transformation so rapid and so total that the people living through it could barely describe what was happening around them. You find horses and mud and gas lamps and the smell of manure and sawdust and coal smoke. You find a place that was within the span of a single decade, reinventing itself from the ground up. This is Times Square in the 1900s, before the neon lights, before the world was watching. The intersection that would become Times Square was not always called by that name. For most of the 19th century, the area at the convergence of Broadway and 7th Avenue at 42nd Street was known as Longacre Square. The name reflected its function. Longacre Square in the 1890s was the center of New York City's carriage industry, the Detroit of horse-drawn transportation in the most horse-dependent city in the world. The blocks surrounding the square were packed with stables, blacksmith shops, carriage manufacturers, harness makers, veterinarians, and feed suppliers. The smell was extraordinary and constant. Horse manure accumulated on the streets faster than it could be removed. In summer, the stench carried for blocks. In winter, the frozen streets were layered with compacted manure and straw that turned to a brown slick when temperatures rose. This was not a glamorous district. It was a working, industrial, animal-powered neighborhood that existed to service the transportation needs of a city of 3 million people who moved almost entirely by horse. The transformation began with a death in newspaper. In 1896, the New York Herald moved its headquarters to Herald Square, several blocks to the south, and the publisher Adolph Oakes acquired the struggling New York Times. Oakes was not content to run a newspaper from a midtown backwater. He was ambitious, promotional, and acutely aware that the location of a newspaper's headquarters was itself a form of advertising. In 1902, Oakes announced that the New York Times would construct a new headquarters building at the intersection of Broadway, 7th Avenue, and 42nd Street, the old Longacre Square. The building would be called the Times Tower. It would be, at the time of its completion, one of the tallest buildings in New York City, and the neighborhood around it, Oakes lobbied successfully, would be renamed. On April 8, 1904, Longacre Square officially became Times Square. The newspaper had purchased its own geography. The Times Tower itself was completed in 1904 and opened on January 1, 1905, with a fireworks display that Oakes organized as a civic celebration and, not coincidentally, as a promotion for his newspaper. The building rose 25 stories from a triangular plot of land so narrow at its southern tip that the base was barely large enough for the elevator shafts. The architects, Idlitz and Mackenzie, designed it in the Italian Renaissance style, faced with terracotta and limestone, with ornamental detail on every facade. It was not the most beautiful building in New York, but it was visible from extraordinary distances in every direction, and that visibility was entirely the point. The Times Tower announced that this intersection, this formerly malodorous carriage district, was now the center of something new. But what was Times Square in the 1900s, before the entertainment industry fully colonized it? The answer is more complicated and more interesting than the simple story of theaters replacing stables. The neighborhood in the first decade of the 20th century was in a state of genuine flux. Multiple industries competing for the same blocks, the old carriage trade retreating but not yet gone, the theater industry expanding but not yet dominant, the hotel business beginning to recognize that this location, close to both the theater district and a new Pennsylvania station being constructed to the south, was potentially extremely valuable. Walking through Times Square in 1903 or 1905 or 1907 meant navigating a neighborhood that was simultaneously several different things at once. Part working district, part entertainment zone, part construction site, part spectacle. The streets themselves were the first thing a visitor in 1905 would notice, and not favorably. Broadway was a wide diagonal boulevard cutting across the regular Manhattan grid, and at its intersection with 7th Avenue, it created the irregular triangular geometry that still defines the area today. But the street surface was a mixture of cobblestone and Belgian block, rough, uneven paving that was hard on horses' hooves, hard on wagon wheels, and extremely hard on the ankles of pedestrians attempting to cross quickly. The street was crowded with traffic of a kind that modern visitors to Times Square cannot easily imagine. Not cars, which were present but still rare and unreliable in the early 1900s, but horses. Thousands of horses moved through the Midtown Street grid every day, pulling streetcars on iron rails embedded in the pavement, hauling delivery wagons loaded with goods for the hotels and restaurants and construction sites, carrying individual riders, drawing the private carriages of the wealthy. The noise was constant. Hoofbeats on stone, the iron rims of wheels grinding on cobbles, the shouts of drivers, the bells of the streetcars, the general din of a mechanical civilization that used animals as its primary engine. The electric streetcar had arrived in Manhattan in the 1890s, and by the early 1900s, the streetcar lines running up Broadway and along 42nd Street were carrying enormous numbers of passengers. The cars were open in summer, wooden benches running the width of the car, with canvas awnings and no sides, so that passengers sat exposed to the air and to the street. In winter, they were closed wooden cars with coal stoves at each end, the windows fogged with the breath of packed commuters. The fare was a nickel. The cars were chronically overcrowded, running behind schedule, because the tracks shared the street with horse traffic that could not be moved or hurried. A journey by streetcar through Midtown in 1905 was slow, uncomfortable, and frequently delayed. But it was how the majority of New Yorkers who did not walk got from one place to another above ground. Below ground, the situation was about to change dramatically. The first line of the New York City subway opened in October 1904, running from City Hall in Lower Manhattan up to 145th Street in Harlem, with a stop at Times Square. The subway was an immediate and overwhelming success. On its first day of operation, more than 150,000 people rode it. Within weeks, it was carrying numbers that strained its capacity. The 42nd Street station at Times Square became one of the busiest points on the entire system almost immediately, because Times Square sat at the intersection of everything: north-south routes, east-west crosstown connections, the theater district, the hotels, the restaurants. The subway did not create Times Square as an entertainment center, but it made Times Square accessible to the entire city in a way that no previous transportation technology had. A working-class family in the Bronx or Brooklyn could now reach 42nd Street in 20 minutes for a nickel. The audience for Times Square's theaters and restaurants expanded overnight from the carriage-owning wealthy and the walking-distance middle class to essentially the entire population of New York City. The theater industry had been moving northward up Broadway for decades, following the city's population as it expanded uptown. By the early 1900s, the cluster of legitimate theaters, meaning theaters presenting plays and musicals rather than variety acts, had reached the blocks around 42nd Street and Times Square and was continuing to push northward. The theaters being built in this period were not the intimate venues of the earlier 19th century. They were palaces, large, ornately decorated houses with lobbies finished in marble and gilded plasterwork, with seating for 1,000 or 1,500 audience members, with electric lighting that was still new enough to be a selling point and an attraction in itself. The New Amsterdam Theater, which opened on 42nd Street in 1903, was among the finest theaters in the world, a masterpiece of Art Nouveau design, with an interior of such elaborate beauty that audience members arriving for the first time often stopped in the lobby simply to look at the walls and ceiling before finding their seats. The productions filling these new theaters in the 1900s were a mixture of forms that would be unfamiliar in their specifics to a modern theatergoer, but recognizable in their general outlines. The musical theater of the early 1900s was not yet the integrated book musical that would emerge from the Rodgers and Hammerstein era. It was more loosely structured, a series of songs, comic sketches, and specialty acts connected by a minimal narrative thread, with elaborate costume and scenic design, and with stars whose names sold tickets regardless of the show surrounding them. Florenz Ziegfeld had not yet launched the Follies that would make his name synonymous with Broadway spectacle. The first Follies came in 1907, and the fully elaborated Ziegfeld Follies began in 1908. But the appetite for exactly that kind of extravagant, star-driven, visually overwhelming entertainment was already present and growing. The hotels of Times Square in the early 1900s were among the most luxurious in the world. The Hotel Astor, which opened in 1904 on Broadway between 44th and 45th Streets, was an 11-story Beaux-Arts palace with over 500 rooms, a rooftop garden, multiple ballrooms, a billiard room, a barbershop, and a dining room large enough to serve 1,000 guests simultaneously. The guests who stayed there included industrialists and politicians, theater stars and foreign dignitaries, anyone who wanted to be seen in the center of New York social life. The Hotel Astor's rooftop garden was a particular attraction in summer, an open-air dining and entertainment space several stories above the street, with views across Midtown Manhattan, where fashionable New Yorkers ate dinner and watched the city below without being in it. It was, in its way, an early version of the elevated spectator position that Times Square has always offered to those with the money to access it. The restaurants surrounding the theater district operated on a schedule calibrated to the theater. They filled before the curtain and after it, and the hours between 10 in the evening and 2 in the morning were among their busiest. Rector's at Broadway and 44th Street was the most famous restaurant in New York in the early 1900s, a glittering establishment with a facade studded with electric lights, a 2-story dining room hung with chandeliers, and a clientele that included every important name in New York society, politics, theater, and crime. The cuisine was elaborate and expensive, multi-course meals in the French style, with dishes prepared tableside, wine lists running to hundreds of selections, serviced by waiters in formal attire. A dinner for 2 at Rector's could cost more than a factory worker made in a week. The restaurant existed in a different economic universe from the streets outside it. But those streets were visible through the windows, and the contrast was part of the experience. The streets outside those restaurant windows were, in the early 1900s, beginning to change in a way that would eventually produce the Times Square we know. The electric sign was not yet neon. Neon gas was not used in advertising signs until the 1910s and did not become widespread until the 1920s. But electric incandescent bulbs, which had become cheap enough to use in large numbers by the early 1900s, were being deployed in advertising with rapidly escalating ambition. The theaters outlined their marquees and facades in electric bulbs. The hotels illuminated their names in letters visible from blocks away. The restaurants advertised with electric signs above their doors. And the entrepreneurs who recognized that the walls and rooftops of buildings facing the theater crowd offered an extraordinary advertising platform were beginning to erect large-scale electric signs that used hundreds or thousands of individual bulbs to display text and simple images. By 1905, the intersection was bright enough at night to be visible from the Hudson River. By 1910, a journalist writing about the area coined the phrase that would stick, the Great White Way, describing the brilliance of Broadway from 23rd Street to 47th Street, lit from below and above by the collective output of tens of thousands of electric bulbs. The people who inhabited Times Square in the 1900s were as various as the neighborhood's competing functions. In the mornings, before the theaters opened, and while the hotels were still hosting their breakfast guests, the streets belonged to the workers, the stagehands and electricians arriving to prepare for evening performances, the delivery men bringing supplies to the hotel kitchens, the construction workers continuing the seemingly endless building projects that were adding new structures to every block. By afternoon, the sidewalks filled with a different crowd. Shoppers, tourists, young men and women from the outer boroughs who came to Midtown to look at the department stores and the theater lobbies and the general spectacle of a neighborhood that was visibly becoming something important. By evening, the composition shifted again. The theater crowd arriving in their finest clothes, stepping out of private carriages or emerging from the new subway stations, moving toward the lighted marquees of the New Amsterdam and the Lyric and the Victoria and a dozen other houses. And after midnight, when the theaters had released their audiences and the restaurants were approaching their final sittings, a fourth population emerged. The people of the night, the city's nocturnal economy of varying degrees of legality, the gamblers and the prostitutes, and the late drinkers, and the people who simply preferred the city after dark to the city in daylight. The New Year's Eve celebration of 1904, organized by Adolph Oakes to mark the opening of the Times Tower, was not yet the ball drop that would become one of the most watched events on Earth. The 1904 celebration used fireworks, set off from the roof of the Times Tower, visible across Midtown Manhattan, attended by an estimated 200,000 people who crowded the streets around the square. It was, by the standards of the time, an enormous event. Oakes understood that the celebrations served two purposes simultaneously. It announced the new year to the city, and it announced the New York Times to anyone who might have missed the fact that the newspaper had just built a skyscraper in the middle of the most rapidly transforming neighborhood in Manhattan. The fireworks continued in 1905 and 1906. In 1907, the city prohibited fireworks in the area due to fire concerns, and Oakes commissioned a replacement, a lighted ball that would be lowered from a flagpole atop the Times Tower at midnight, reaching the bottom exactly as the new year began. The first ball drop on December 31st, 1907 to January 1st, 1908, drew an estimated crowd of 200,000 people. The tradition has continued every year since, interrupted only by wartime blackout restrictions in 1942 and 1943. It began, like Times Square itself, as a promotional strategy that became something larger than its origins. By the end of the first decade of the 20th century, the transformation of the neighborhood was essentially complete. The carriage trade had retreated further north into the outer boroughs, driven out by rising rents and the accelerating replacement of the horse by the automobile. The stables and blacksmith shops and harness makers were gone, replaced by theaters and hotels and restaurants and office buildings, and the first tentative appearances of the movie houses that would multiply dramatically in the following decade. The automobile itself was beginning to appear on the streets in numbers that would have been unimaginable 10 years earlier. Not yet dominant, not yet the controlling fact of street life, but present and growing, their exhaust mixing with the residual smell of horse and the coal smoke from the buildings and the particular smell of electric motors and ozone from the streetcars. Times Square in 1909 or 1910 smelled different from Times Square in 1900. It looked different. It sounded different. It was populated differently and governed differently and lit differently. The neon had not arrived yet. The great commercial spectacle of the mid-20th century was still decades away. But the bones of it, the geography, the transportation infrastructure, the theatrical tradition, the hotel culture, the appetite for spectacle that the neighborhood both fed and created, were all in place. Times Square in the 1900s was not yet the place the world knows. It was the place becoming that place. And that becoming, compressed into a single decade, was one of the most remarkable urban transformations in American history.